Fears of terrorism rising to new levels in the US.
The Paris Climate Change Agreement
Saudi Arabia targets schools in Yemen.
The state of fear appears to be heading toward completely new levels in the US. Just take a look at these headlines. US needs to get terrorism threat into perspective. Terrorists may have planned attacks for Chicago. Now look at this. A new study shows that the Americans are more fearful about the likelihood of another terrorist attack than at any other time since the weeks after September 11 terror attacks in 2001. All of these take us to the question, why has the United States, among so many countries, become the target of so many threats?
This threat of terrorism is a tool that is used by the U.S. government to foster its own intentions. In this case, they're trying to take down Assad. They talk about fighting the terrorist organization ISIS, but there's an awful lot of proof that they were involved in creating it. And there's also an awful lot of proof that because ISIS is fighting Syria, that they're really not trying very hard to fight ISIS, and in some cases actually helping ISIS.
The rise in threats of terrorist activities come at a time that the US is preparing to choose a new president in a year. And terrorism is today a hot topic in campaigns of presidential candidates. Republican candidate Donald Trump, whose controversial remarks are like everyday headlines, is believed to be making good use of the growing public fear of terrorism. But he may not be the only one who's doing this.
Well, you've got Trump, who is creating the fear and feeding from it. And you've got some of his leading rivals also talking with the same language. This is hate language. This is bigotry. This is the kind of thing that led to putting Japanese in camps during World War II. This is the same kind of thing that is keeping refugees from Syria from coming to the United States. The same kind of thinking that they used to keep German Jews from coming to the United States who were refugees.
President Barack Obama still faces criticism for the handling of terrorism by his administration. Obama has been specifically drawing the anger of his critics for doing nothing particular beyond stereotype speeches.
Prejudice and discrimination helps ISIL, and it undermines our national security. The good news is that Americans are coming together to reaffirm the core values that keep us strong.
There is an organization, the Center for Security Policy. This is an organization that is funded by a collection of billionaires, and it released the poll that Trump has been using to fan the fires of anti-Muslim, anti-Islam hatred and bigotry. This organization is run by Frank Gaffney. He's a right-winger who has a long history of manipulating the media and the narrative and the story that is being told. What you've got is an organization that attempts to raise fears and raise the hate for Islam.
Many believe that the heavy shadow of fear caused as a result of threats of terrorist attacks inside the US could soon lead to many changes in Washington.
This threat of terrorism is a tool that is used by the U.S. government to foster its own intentions. In this case, they're trying to take down Assad. They talk about fighting the terrorist organization ISIS, but there's an awful lot of proof that they were involved in creating it. And there's also an awful lot of proof that because ISIS is fighting Syria, that they're really not trying very hard to fight ISIS, and in some cases actually helping ISIS.
There's no denying that the current situations that have been created at the international level are the results of US previous policies, particularly in the Middle East. It may be wishful thinking to expect American leaders to come up with something to make things better. And that means that the current status of chaos that has emerged out of the shadows of terrorism will still prevail.
Climate officials from almost 200 countries on Saturday approved a landmark accord to address climate change. This came after 4 years of global negotiations and 2 weeks of intense talks between world leaders.
I see no objections. The Paris Agreement is adopted.
The deal has been praised as a historic turning point, a major step for humanity and an opportunity to change the world, among others. But what is its real significance, and how will it impact life on the planet?
This is very much an open question, right? You see, and this is why I used the word symbolism. You see the words greenhouse gases appear again and again in the text, but you never see the word coal, right? You never see the word oil in the agreement. So there's kind of a very intentional signaling mechanism going on here, which is to say, while many environmentalists, for example, would point to the policy of keeping fossil fuels in the ground, none of that is particularly apparent in the text. And so how do you see something like the Paris Agreement translate to real action on fossil fuels? This is exactly what people are going to try to figure out over the next 5 years.
The Paris Climate Change Agreement will basically lower the limit to stop temperatures from rising further. But if you want some key details, here they are. The agreement calls for holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. To achieve that goal, countries should reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. And it also asks all countries to update their national targets for reducing emissions by 2020 and every 5 years thereafter. Now the question is, what are the political as well as economic implications that these will cause for the countries?
So I think China walks away with a good deal. They're able to say, look at this climate action that we're engaged in. Look at this bilateral agreement that we've signed with the U.S. And look at what we're doing in specific cities, right? The Republican Party in the U.S. is, effectively the only political segment in the entire world that is broadly rejecting climate science and broadly rejecting action. Now, this is a problem because they obviously control Congress, and if we want to do anything serious in the U.S., we're going to need to go through that route. So the implication there is the U.S. is kind of walking on thin ice with respect to its own promises, and desperately needs to deliver if it wants to demonstrate any kind of integrity with respect to kind of the global pact that it just signed on to.
Paris has been witnessing multiple days of protests by environmental activists against what they have been describing as a weak accord to save the planet.
This red line action was about telling governments that they are crossing red lines for the people and climate justice every day, and that this agreement will cross red lines as well. It's not good enough in terms of making sure that no one gets left behind. Some countries, some people, some communities will suffer extreme loss and damage because of the impacts of climate change, and none of this will be accounted for in the agreement.
There's a poll released today that shows that 70% of Indians want 100% clean energy, and only 15% of them want to burn coal to develop. If they can start moving in that direction, we could see this really bold and ambitious agreement come to reality.
But how will the promises for climate warming control affect poor nations? Those nations are the worst affected by the consequences of global warming that itself has been caused as a result of industrialization.
The thing about, many, especially low-lying developing countries is that that's not necessarily the long term, right? You see island nations getting swallowed up by the sea already. So the disadvantages, are exceptionally apparent in terms of what is happening, right? These countries are drowning and these countries are drying out.
The Paris climate change deal will now replace the much criticized Kyoto Protocol that basically failed to meet its objectives. But serious doubts still exist on whether the mechanisms that have been envisaged in the deal will actually work. Amid all these uncertainties, hope is currently the only thing stronger than fear as to what may happen to the future of the planet.
Saudi Arabia is under fire, this time by Amnesty International. The rights group has issued a damning report on Saudi Arabia's aggression against Yemen. And the findings are shocking. Saudi Arabia targets schools in Yemen.
الآن هنا احنا عايشين في خوف وفراب. اليوم أنا شفت الطائرة وخفت كثير ورعبت. إن صوت اليوم كان عالي، بس كان لو كان شعور في المدرسة مثل شعور الطالبات اللي في المدرسة اليوم كانوا. طبعا شنخاف كنا.
But let's take a detailed look at the findings of the investigation. Amnesty International investigated 5 Saudi airstrikes that took place between August and October in Hajjah, Sana'a, and Hodeidah. The strikes targeted schools without any evidence that they had been used for military purposes. The attacks severely disrupted the education of over 6,500 children who regularly attended schools. The airstrikes killed 5 and injured at least 14 civilians, including 4 children.
أنا كنت في البداية راكد في المكتب فوق الطائرة بالدور. دخلت أرش وجهي على كنت بلبس جرام بخرج يعني لو صوت الصاروخ.
But that's not all. Amnesty has also received information from the Sana'a-based Ministry of Education about the extent of damage to Yemen's education system. 255 schools in the country have been completely destroyed. 608 schools have been partially damaged, and 421 are being used to host internally displaced Yemenis. And according to UNICEF, 34% of the children in Yemen have not gone to school since the conflict began in March 2015.
Thousands of civilians have been killed, been wounded, have been maimed because of Saudi Arabia, and the West is turning a blind eye to that, and that demonstrates yet again another example of how the West, America and Britain, is not genuinely committed to human rights, the rule of law and democracy.
But who provides Saudi Arabia with the deadly weapons? The report says some of the weapons used by Saudi Arabia to hit civilian targets in Yemen were produced or designed by 2 of the world's biggest arms producers, the US and the UK. And let's not forget the fact that Washington has signed the Arms Trade Treaty and London has actually ratified it. But are the US and the UK sticking to their obligations?
it's a source of big revenue for the Americans and for the British. In Britain, for example, BAE Systems sells an immense amount of military hardware to Saudi Arabia each year. It runs in tens of millions of pounds every year and even more. So the Americans and the British, they see an opportunity to strengthen, to increase the revenues.
Let's take a look at the facts. Article 6 of ATT says a country is prohibited from authorizing an arms transfer if it has knowledge at the time of authorization that the arms would be used in the commission of attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians. And Article 7 of ATT requires that states assess the potential of the arms being exported could be used to commit a serious violation of international human rights or humanitarian law.
So it's not in the interests of the American government and the British government to highlight what one of their closest friends in the world, and let's emphasize that, in the world, is doing in Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world.
Well, that's not what the US and the UK are doing. And let's remember, both countries have also been providing technical, logistical, and intelligence support to Saudi Arabia.